Okay, in terms of the stuff,
Thank you, sir.
deadlines remain unchanged. So, quizzes part 1, deadline is Friday at 11 to 9 p.m. Exam 1, quizzes part 2, October 19th, end of day. Exam 2, quizzes part 3, November 16th. Then exam 3, exam 4, quizzes part 4, December 7th, the day they shall live in infamy. And then exam 5, the final, if you need to take the final, deadline 5 is December 14th at noon. All this stuff's been available since day 0, and just be sure to complete a 5 before the end. For the paper, draft November 9th, +5 deadline November 14th, emergency deadline for full credit November 21st, and then the desperation deadline December 8th. Before going to finish up our good dead friend Democritus, and then to our good dead friends Plato and Aristotle, anything about any previous stuff that needs more stuff? Okay, so looking at Democritus back in the ancient days of writing, and he's the guy that coined the term, mentioned the term atoms. And then later, centuries later, when scientists were, doing the physics stuff and looking at the stuff, they said, hey, let's call these atoms after our good dead friend Democritus. Now, of course, the atoms he's thinking of are not, he's not thinking of like a neutron, protons, and electrons and stuff and shells. He thinks of these things, probably the best metaphor I can think of would be kind of like Legos in a way. You can think of them as kind of like metaphysical Legos. They're not like electrons, protons, and neutrons. They would be just, small building pieces. And for him, the quality of the atoms are such that they're indivisible. So if you had a sword that could cut anything in half that could be cut, it would bounce off the atoms because they're uncuttable. There's nothing smaller. Now, as he sees it, though, these atoms would have, shapes, which in a way, if something exists and has any, dimensions, it would have some type of shape. And he believed that the way stuff is produced, all the qualities of things would be based on the shapes of the atoms. So, for example, solid matter would be hooked or rough atoms that can hook together. Solid matter would be made of, as he sees it, if you were able to somehow see their shapes, they would be hooked or rough, so they would stick together or connect together, making solid objects. That way you can't
Push do solid atoms that hooks together.
Yep, made of hooks and rough toast.
Since it says they're indivisible, but so nothing is smaller than them.
Right.
But they come in different shapes, so could one just be a wedge shape and make one into two?
They'd still have to be one. Yeah, because they couldn't be broken regardless of the shape. Or so he claims. What do you mean like a wedge shape? Do you mean like one could cut another one, or it could be like it could
Yeah,
be
like
shaped?
if they hit each other hard enough, it would be like breaking a Lego.
Oh yeah, he'd say they would be
Nothing that would be smaller than itself, but it'd still be itself.
Yeah, he'd say that no, because even if they hit each other really hard, they just couldn't break. They'd be on. They have no smaller parts they could be broken into. Or so he claims. Yeah, so for him, it's a good point. Even if they were, shot at each other like super velocities, they would just bounce off. So it'd be, kind of metaphorically, like if you have the irresistible force moving an immovable object, and nothing. This would be the unbreakable hitting the unbreakable, and nothing would happen. Well, they'd bounce into each other. Liquids then for him would be made up of smooth atoms, forming the liquids, because they were smooth shapes. And then, again, as mentioned before, this later gets developed into theories of perception. So sweet things would also be smooth atoms. Bitter things would be sharp atoms. And interestingly, he turned out to be correct. As I mentioned on Friday, there's a cereal called Kix, and when they're back in the 90s, their advertising was, the taste is in the shape. And they were right. because the way things taste, it's the interaction of the molecules on our taste buds, and it's the shape of the things. And you can influence the taste of things by altering their shapes.
Really?
I mean, one, at a macro level, like, this is not like an exact analogy, but if you have like a shaker for doing like, protein shakes or something, if you put orange juice in there and just put the cap on and shake it, orange juice tastes a bit different if it's like been shaken up so there's air in it. It tastes slightly different. And similar like how you cut foods, that can affect the flavor a little. Not radical. It's not like if you cut like a onion right, it would taste like pineapple. But the way you prepare and cut foods, the shape does affect the flavor.
Didn't know.
No, neither did I. Until I learned about some food stuff. So in a way, this part was kind of correct. Now, in terms of the how reality works, again, kind of the big schools are there's purpose, the teleological universe, and then there's like total no purpose, and then of course there are areas in between, like degrees of how much control there is. And Democritus is like total, random chaos. It's simply atoms in the void colliding randomly. So no God, no purpose, no meaning, stuff just happens. And again, we see here, one reason why Democritus is important is because we see in very early form, in a way, kind of what's a popular modern worldview. The world is composed of atoms. Everything is what it is because of the material components. There is no purpose or meaning. It's all just random.
So how do you figure that, and how did you fix that analogy with bitter things are made up of sharp apples?
Oh, he thinks literally that, that they're, the way he'd see it is like when you're eating something bitter, it's like jabbing you, that's how you taste it. In a way, he's kind of right, because when stuff tastes bitter, in most cases, the food is trying to poison you. For real. The reason why things like broccoli and certain plants are bitter is because they're actually slightly toxic to us. But it's a good way, it's a good toxin, because they found actually that being exposed to toxins in the right amount is actually healthy for you. But literally broccoli is trying to kill. It is slightly, because it's the stuff that's used, plants and for the most part have chemicals in them that poison insects or try to, so the insects won't eat them. And broccoli is, poisonous to some things. Not really poisonous to us, but it is really toxic.
The only use for broccoli is fiber.
It also has lots of important nutrients. And there's a theory now, which may be disproven eventually, that part of developing your immune system is eating plants because they have, the theory is, they have developed toxins and defenses against insects and us, and the view is that it helps your immune system. It's kind of like, you might have heard the hypothesis that one reason why there's so much asthma and peanut allergies today is because people would raise their kids in like super clean environments, and so they never developed the exposure to the dirt. And so there's a theory that exposure to toxins and, not too much, but, contaminants and stuff sort of primes and triggers your immune system.
It has some plausibility.
Yeah, that's what they claim. I was a kid, I was out in the dirt and stuff, so.
When we were growing up, we played in the dirt.
All you had was dirt. It was before they invented anything. You said dirt and sticks. And you had to bring your own sticks. So now we turn away from the pre-Socratics to the Socrates, namely Plato. Now, in the case of Plato, he is, in most of his dialogues, presenting the character of Socrates, talking about various topics. Now, we know that Socrates existed, we know that Plato existed, and Socrates, of course, is best known for his view of, his claim of that wisdom means you know.
Yeah, know all.
No, less than all. Not less than all. You know nothing.
Nothing, that's right.
Yeah,
Nothing.
because what you know is, what little you know compared to all that you don't know is effectively nothing. And of course, he got in trouble for that, for interrogating powerful people, and was put to death after a trial and drank hemlock and died. Now the death of Socrates, of course, had a profound influence on Plato. It's his origin story. Just like in the case of Batman, Batman becomes transforms from Bruce Wayne to Batman. Why?
His parents died?
Yeah, his parents are killed, so he becomes the Batman. Plato, of course, Socrates is killed, so he becomes the Plato, and creates the Platonic cave. Now, Plato, of course, is well known for a couple things. One, of course, is all the philosophy that he creates, a comprehensive philosophy, and his ultimate goal is to create a just society that doesn't kill good people. So, hence he writes the famous book, The Republic. And to get to that, Plato believed that you had to do all the other philosophy first. You know, epistemology, metaphysics, and then the hardest philosophy would be ethics. The second thing he was well known for, of course, is the academy. He created a school near a grove of trees dedicated to the hero academics. Hence we get our term academics and academy. And if the hero had been named Bob, we'd be doing Bobademics at the Bobademy, which would seem perfectly reasonable, because it would make perfect sense. And then, of course, he died. Now, like many philosophers, he had hoped that he could take his ideas and have them put into the world. And he, to this end, he instructed a ruler of Syracuse named Dionysius the Younger. And that did not go well, because Dionysius drove him away, almost killing him. As a general rule, if your students are trying to kill you, probably something going wrong. Well, clearly something going wrong. And so his ideas really didn't stick. But in a way they did, because we're still talking about it today. Now, Plato's epistemology, his theory of knowledge, and his metaphysics are inextricably stuck together. So you get exposed to some epistemology, which is theory of knowledge. If you want the full epistemology, in the spring there'll be the epistemology class, and we'll get to talk about Plato again. Now, since our focus is on metaphysics, we'll kind of go through the epistemology, not like super quick, but we'll kind of tick through it to get to the metaphysics. Now, one of the big concerns of Plato, when it came to like knowing stuff, is this. He had the following main opponents. First, there was the view that knowledge, and this is kind of a sensible view, knowledge means that you have an opinion, and your opinion is
Either true or false.
true, yeah, true, that you have right opinion. And that was the common view. I mean, if you ask people, hey, well, how do you know something? They'd say, well, when I believe it and I got it right. And Plato said, not good enough. You need more stuff. So one enemy of his is the view that knowledge is just true opinion. Second enemy of his is relativism, that there is truth, but truth is relative to the culture, or relative to, or even subjective, just relative to the person. So he wants to beat relativism. His third enemy is what's called empiricism. And empiricism is the view that what you know about the world ultimately has to trace back to something that gets in through the senses. Now this could involve things like scientific instruments, like MRIs, radio telescopes, etc. But ultimately it's going to be like an empirical observation, as opposed to just thinking about it by pure reason. So those are his three foes. Now, he knocks out relativism pretty quick, probably too quickly. And what he does is this. He does agree that some things are relative. So, for example, I'm from Maine, and Maine is a fairly cold state. So to me, how does Florida probably feel all the time?
Hot.
Super, even December, it's like, so hot. I have friends from Miami and Puerto Rico, and they think that Tallahassee is cold. And I've been to Puerto Rico, I'm like, yeah, I can see why you think Tallahassee is cold, because Puerto Rico almost killed me. Because I was there, no air conditioning, because I was, hanging out in all the places with no AC. And I thought I was going to die, because I'm like, I'm from Maine. I was brought up to live in ice and snow. I really didn't think I was going to make it. And then I understood why people think Tallahassee is cold, because Puerto Rico is beautiful, but it is just incredibly, incredibly hot. Even though I was there in the winter, I'm like, this is the winter, it's like, yeah, this is the, yeah, I'm like, I'm glad I'm not here in the summer, because I would be super dead. So yeah, so some things are relative. So if you're from, Maine, Puerto Rico Tallahassee seems pretty warm. If you're from Puerto Rico, or even South Florida, Tallahassee seems, especially in winter, seems kind of cold. So Plato doesn't deny that. But he thinks that relativism as a view is self-defeating. And he gives either a clever or just a trick of language argument. It goes like this. Relativism is a view that ultimately all opinions, all claims are, all opinions are true. So the opinion that not all opinions are true must be true. So
Say that again now.
of all, yeah. So if relativism is the view that all opinions are true, that means the opinion that not all opinions are true must be true. So if relativism is true, then it is false, because its denial is also an opinion. But if it's false, then it's false. So if it's true, it's false. If it's false, it's false. So it's got to be false.
So you see how I hate it out there.
Exactly. So it's either brilliant or just a trick of words. But as Plato thinks that's good enough. Now the character of Socrates also takes a shot at Pythagoras. Pythagoras was a sophist who charged for his teaching, and he takes a shot at all sophists. The sophists were, one of the things that they believed in was relativism. And they believed that there was no objective truth about morality and goodness. And so as a practical matter, what they said is, well, if there's no good or bad, right or wrong, so what do you do? And they said, well, success, winning in modern parlance would be what matters. And for a fee, they would teach people how to sway the masses and how to win. And there are basically two types of advice that they gave about how to deal with morality. One was just go along with whatever society does. It's not correct, but if you violate the morality of the public, the foolish public, then they'll be dismayed and won't support you. Or alternative two is just do whatever you want, just never get caught. Just be sneaky about it. And all that matters is when truth is relative. Today the sophists are back. Well, they never left. So people talk about alternative facts and fake news, and that truth is not truth. They're sophists. When I saw Kellyanne Conway doing her thing, I'm like, you're a sophist. That's like the sophists are back. Welcome back. It's good to see you again. And the greatest enemy of the sophist is, of course, objective truth. So you think philosophers are bad, at least we would agree, we agree that there's, truth. The sophists are like, there's not even truth. We just do whatever it takes to win. And so what did Socrates say against that? Well, he said, well, if all truth is relative, then why am I paying you money? Because if everybody's opinion is as good as anybody else's, there's no sense in paying people to teach things because your view is already as good as theirs. Why pay them? Maybe like if you already had, shoes, why pay someone else for their shoes when your shoes are just as good? No reason to, unless you just need more shoes. So he's like, relativism, don't. So then he moves on to empiricism, which he considers a much more formidable opponent, because he gives multiple arguments. Now, the problem he sees with the senses, and this will tie into metaphysics as well, is he agrees with Heraclitus. The world is constantly changing, all the time. So because of this, because of the metaphysical changing of the world, and the non-metaphysical, which is the normal change, you can't be certain. I'll use a concrete example. How many people drove to campus today? Was your car on fire when you left it?
Yes.
No, it could be. Is it on fire now?
Yes, I know.
Yeah, you don't know. Yeah, you don't know. You don't hear any fire alarms, so maybe you go back and you're like, my car.
I thought you were trying to do a trick question with the sun or something.
No tricks this time. This time, you're good to be on your guard. Yeah, so you left your car, not on fire, hopefully, and now could be on fire. You don't know. And so there's all kinds of things that we observed a little while ago that we don't know if they're true now. So we can't have any certainty. The only thing we can do is to say that it seemed like this at a particular time. Like when I left my car, it seemed like it wasn't on fire. I think it's probably not on fire now, but I'm not sure. Now, because of this, Plato believes that knowledge requires certainty. It can't be just, it looks like this, probably right. You gotta be certain. Now, this becomes a debate, still a debate today. Does knowledge require that you be certain? Or does it allow room for doubt? Now, if you take the epistemology class, you'll see that if you leave room for doubt, then the skeptic who says you don't know stuff just says, nope, if you're not certain, you could be totally wrong, so you don't know anything. And that's kind of
one is theory and the other one is like law.
Well, yeah, certainty would be, one question is about the theory behind it, but certainty would mean you'd know for sure. Couldn't be.
Again, it's like law.
Couldn't be wrong.
And the other one is theory, is something that you suppose, it's an assumption.
Yeah, and Plato thinks if you're gonna know it, it's gotta be certain, can't be any doubt. Then later, people like our good dead friend Descartes, embraced that, said you gotta find absolute certainty. So one of the big debates in theory of knowledge is, do you have to have certainty, or can you get by with less? And of course, there are problems either way. Now, the senses, he claims, can't give us certainty, because all we can say is it looks like this now, therefore we can't give knowledge to our senses. So he says empiricism out. But again, he considers empiricism a worthy opponent.
He says, what about appearances? Could you repeat that again?
Oh, sure. He says when it comes to just the world of appearances, we can't know, because all we can say is, well, one problem is time. Like, if we're not looking at it, who knows? And even if we are looking at it, all we can say is that, like if you look at what seem to be people around you, and you look at someone and say, I don't think that they're like an alien or a Terminator or something, but you don't know, you're not certain. So he thinks the senses can't give us certainty. Knowledge requires certainty, so the senses can't give us knowledge. Now, there are others who argue you don't need certainty, like John Locke, for example. Now, his second argument, and Socrates is really, as we saw, as we will see, really big on definitions. And he claims that what you know has got to be unchanging, otherwise you can't know it, because it becomes constantly changing. And it's got to be, a universal. We'll see more of those in the near future. Because he believes you would need unchanging definitions of things. Otherwise, language wouldn't work. So if the meanings of words were constantly shifting, you would not be able to use language. Now, in a way, Plato is kind of right, but also kind of wrong. How so? Well, let's imagine like a weird, scenario, kind of like a Twilight Zone type of deal, where the meaning of words just constantly changed. Just constant, like, every few minutes. Would it make communication really difficult?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because you'd never know. Imagine everybody had randomizers. Like what it would do in their brain is it would just match up words with random definitions. You would really be saying like spork, and you'd say the same words, but nothing would mean, you'd have no idea what people meant. On the other hand, do definitions change over time? Yeah, they should. So maybe what Plato should have said is, definitions don't have to be like unchanging, they just have to change slowly enough that you're able to track. But then you can also make the argument some things would have to like never change, otherwise we would not be able to communicate. But again, an opposing viewpoint would be, yeah, they can't, randomize, but as long as they change slowly enough, we can adapt, and that's
But his point was that with knowledge being universal, we all will be on the same page, we all be thinking the same thing. Not that, when I was reading it doesn't change, but if we all saying sun, we know we mean that ball of fire up in the sky. You know, you can't mean say sun again, you mean a star or the moon. So if it changed, it would change universal, so we'll still all be on the same page.
Yeah, I mean, as long as everybody changed together.
Yeah,
You know, if you had a randomizer, but everybody randomized the same way, then.
yeah, that's the way when I was reading it.
Yeah, so you could say his argument, and people have argued that it doesn't, you know, that one doesn't, you know, kill empiricism. But wait, he's got more. He has a third argument. Perfect standard argument. Now, in his day, this had some bite, but as we'll see in a moment, it is even more bite today. Yeah, with more bite. Here's the thing. The good example he used was in geometry. Now, in geometry, we think of perfect circles, perfect squares. But going back to Plato's time, could someone by hand draw a truly perfect circle? No, even with, you know, yeah, if you have a computer laser printing at, say, 1200 DPI using PostScript, you could still take out like a magnifying glass and look at it and see it's still imperfect. And so Plato's right. You know, when we have standards of things, if you take, again, like you take non-controversial like geometry, there'd always be a defect in it. But he claims, we realize this. We realize we have the concept of like perfect circle, or more abstractly, perfect justice, perfect beauty. And we realize, he claims, that things here fall short because we have a concept of something perfect. So we know the circle isn't perfect because we have an idea of a perfect circle. We know that no matter how gorgeous a supermodel is, that he or she is still not perfectly beautiful. They still have a defect. And his claim is, this can't come from the senses because we never see a perfect anything. Never see perfect justice, we never see a perfect circle, we never see perfect beauty. There's always defects. So if we have a perfect standard, it couldn't come from the senses. So it has to come from something great, or something else, something perfect that's not here, not sensible.
So what is this perfect thing?
Ah, glad you asked. As we'll see, it's what he calls the forms.
Ah.
They are perfect, they don't change.
Oh, that's just-
Yeah, so they solve all the problems.
Mhm.
Now, as I mentioned, back in his day, this had some bite, but today it is even more bite. And here's why. We'll take length, like 1 meter. Now, one problem that comes up, as a practical matter, doesn't seem like a big deal. Suppose you want to measure something, you know, see if it's a meter long. How do you do it?
Get a ruler or yardstick.
Yeah, you get a meter stick or yardstick and you measure it. Now, how do you know that your meter stick is really a meter?
We assume that the measurements on the stick are proper.
Yeah, because they used to have, they probably still sell them, but they used to sell joke rulers for fishing. And it would be like, it'd have like a normal rule, then have like the fishing ruler, which would be, so like you would say, you'd have, the normal one was properly calibrated, the fishing one was, way off. So you can see, you can measure and say, how big your fish really is. Yeah, so to know your meter stick is a meter long, you need to measure it. But of course, the question is, how do I know that my meter stick I'm metering with is really a meter? Now, the solution they came up to solve this problem was they had a official meter rod made of a special metal, stored in like a tube probably full of inert, the noble gases, the inert gases. Because if you use like a normal stick or something, wood of course can condense. So if you were like had your ruler and your meter stick and you like tapped it on the ground, it's getting a little short every time you tap it. Or if it's warmer, it'll expand a little bit. Or if you have a metal one, if it's cooler, it'll contract, expand. Now, for most stuff, like doing, if you're building, like stairs or, putting in some drywall, if your ruler, if it's like slightly cooler and it's like, a micron smaller, it's like, oh God, my stairs are off by a micron. No big deal. But the more precise you need things to be, the smaller and smaller scales you're working on, then those slight imperfections start to matter. For example, the machining in our jet engines now are incredibly precise, which on one hand is good because we make really good engines. But the downside is that there was a engine part that was off by like I think it's like some fraction of a millimeter, like just, and they didn't notice it, of course, because it's so micro, it's, you know, just a tiny amount. But it was enough so that gradually over time, that tiny submicroscopic flaw meant that the engine eventually just failed. But it was completely unnoticeable. There's no way that you would notice that, just, it would look fine. But that tiny thing did it. And so we're at the point now, or if you know, familiar with computers, that we're at the point now where we're hitting the limits of physical measurement. So if you're setting up your computer and your meter measurement is like off by a tiny amount, like a nanometer, then that could have an effect. If it's off just that little bit, for your stairs it doesn't matter, but for your computer chip or your superprocessed engine, that tiny flaw can make huge amounts of difference. So they found that the meter rod, even though it's stored under gas, etc., it's still affected by gravity, and even if it's kept at a constant temperature, it's still not precisely a meter because it's made of matter. So what they tried doing then was switching to a wavelength of light, particular frequency, because that way that would not. Then of course they're like, wait, light's affected by gravity. And so today we're really seeing it because we're hitting the limits of matter, that our precise amount of measurement we need for length and weight, we're dealing at such a tiny, tiny level that those tiny, tiny disparities have practical implications, like airplanes crashing and chips not working. And so in a way, Plato's point is proven even more, because we need like perfect measurements, but matter can't do it. Matter's imperfect. So Plato was probably like, yeah, I need my forms. Who needs my forms now?
Tell me, how do they measure, like you were speaking of the planes, how do they measure in the movement of the earth so that they will get to the right destination?
Oh, you mean like when planes are flying?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, they use, well, the old-fashioned way is you just look, before they had instruments. But now they use mostly GPS, because the planes have, chip, just like if you use like a GPS watch, so they know, pretty close where they are within a few feet.
Yeah, but I'm saying, if you don't consider the orbit of the earth, if you take off in a plane and you go to New York, you land somewhere else. So you have to figure in the orbital movement of the earth to get to the right place. How is that done?
Well, part of it is that if you're on the planet, you're moving, like the speed of the earth, well, if you're moving the same speed as something else, in a way, that speed doesn't matter. Kind of like when you're in a car, you're going 55 miles an hour, but everyone else in the car is going the same speed, so your speed doesn't. So if you're trying to hand someone, if you're like in a car and you're handing someone a drink, yeah, you are going 55 miles an hour, your drink's going 55 miles an hour, but so is everybody. So it's just like you're sitting still. And so as long as the plane, when it takes off, it's moving it's rotating at the speed of the earth along with the earth, and it takes off, it's still got that speed going. And so as long as it's just flying normally, then it's okay. Yeah, because it's going relative, but they would have to take into account, like the spaceships, they have to take that into account, because of, once it gets off the Earth, it has to take into account relative speed, like how fast. It's one of the problems with time machines. If time travel, if you just moved in time but not in space, you would end up like in space, because the Earth is rotating and orbiting the sun and moving through space. So if you took a time machine back, say 2 days, you would appear where the Earth was 2 days ago. So you'd pop into deep space and be like, oh crap. Which is why on Doctor Who, his ship is the TARDIS, time and relative dimensions in space, so it compensates both for spatial location and temporal location. So when you're traveling in time, always remember to adjust for space, otherwise you'll end up someplace terrible, possibly New Jersey. Yeah, good question. I mean, you're right. I mean, if the Earth is rotating, the question is like, how do objects, how do they deal with that? And they would, with spaceships, they do have to take into account location.
And they got this all through metaphysics.
Oh yeah, the idea is eventually the idea of developing the notions of how gravity works. Originally, gravity was a metaphysical notion. Once you eventually develop, because Newton was doing what he called natural philosophy. So they have this idea of this power, gravity, and then eventually you say, okay, we got some equations for it, so it's science. I still don't know what it is, but we know that when you fall, it hurts. So Plato says that takes care of that. So if you can't get the knowledge from the senses, empiricism doomed. So for him, knowledge has got to be objective, non-relative, because he believes he's crushed the relativist. He believes it can't come from the senses. He also believes it can't be just right opinion. Why not? Well, his reasoning about right opinion is this. If it's just right opinion, it's not enough. Because knowledge is more than just like getting it correct. Because you can get it correct how? Yeah, just by luck. Think of like, in math classes, they usually say, show your work. I mean, part of that is so they give you partial credit, but also part of it is so they know that, I hope they know that you actually know what you're doing. Because you can just guess, 42, and get it right. So Plato thinks that it can't just be opinion that's correct. So to his satisfaction, he thinks he's shown it's got to be objective, non-empirical, universal, changeless, and if it can't be from the senses, it's got to be based in reason. And so, to answer re-answer your question, so then what do we know? His answer is the forms, sometimes translated as the ideas. But I always prefer the forms because the ideas sounds like they're mental things, like existing in your mind. But for Plato, they're they're the realest reals of the real reals. They're the most real. They're also sometimes called universals. Now, people who buy into this kind of metaphysics, reality works like this. You have what are called particulars, sometimes called tokens, and also categories, sometimes called types. So, for example, we're particulars of various categories, like human, student, American, etc. And so every individual, unless it's utterly unique, would be part of a category. And so as he sees it, what makes things fit into categories would be what he calls the forms. Now, they're also called, in a more modern parlance, universals, because, we're individual humans, because there's only one of each of us, but human would be universal because there's lots of humans. There's like, universal humanness. Now, Plato, these forms are, super weird. Now, the reason why he accepts them is because he needs them for his epistemology, because he's got to have something that is non-changing, it's got to be non-perishing, it's got to be perfect, and it's something that's not known through the senses. And so the forms have these qualities. They are eternal, because if they stop being, you couldn't know stuff. You'd be like, what did I used to know? They got to be changeless, because if they changed, you couldn't know them, because they're constantly changing. I mean, to use a metaphor, it's really hard to know, for example, the exact number of people on the planet, because it's constantly changing. People are born, people die. They got to be perfect, again, for his perfect standard argument, because in order to know, like, perfect justice or perfect beauty, you got to have this metaphysically perfect entity. So for him, there are these forms, and for every category that's real, there is a form. So there'd be like a form of human, a form of justice, a form of beauty. Sounds like the Wonder Twins. Now, how does that stuff, the forms, how do they connect to like here? Well, Plato comes up with this concept, which is totally insane, called participation, sometimes called imitation. And the idea is basically this. The forms are not here, because they're not spatial, they're not temporal. And people, you know, typically say they're in a Platonic heaven, so whatever that means.
Is this the ideal world?
Yeah.
thing?
Yeah, exactly. It's the ideal perfect realm. And the perfect realm consists of the forms, and the stuff that's here imitates the forms, or sometimes he says participates in them. Now, I'll use a crappy metaphor to illustrate it. And it's crappy because my metaphors are always crappy, but also because since the forms are perfect, etc., it's not going to work terribly well. But here's the metaphor. Think about like I used to use a photocopier metaphor, but anybody remember photocopiers? Okay, good. Eventually they're going to be like, everyone uses scanners now. I haven't used a photocopier in a long time, because, you know, scanner. Yeah, so like when you're photocopying stuff, you'd have your original, you know, back in the day, like type out like your original, and then you photocopy it. And of course, before photocopiers were pretty, you know, good, the copy would always be what? Yeah, grainy, you know, not so good. And now, of course, if you ever worked someplace that had photocopiers and used forms, like this way used to be everywhere, you know, they would copy the copies. You know, they'd lose the original and they'd start copying the copies. And of course, if you take a grainy copy and copy another grainy copy, you get, and eventually you'll get just these terrible copies. Now, so the form would be like the original perfect version. And then the other ones of that type, say like you have the original form, I don't know, like T86 form, or like your lead form, or whatever the original form is, the form, you know, the literal form of the form. And then of course you have all the copies, then you have copies of copies which are ever worse. And so for Plato, the form would be like that original form. It'd be, you know, the perfect version. And then all the individual ones, all the many, would just be copies of that original. And they'd be imperfect, you know, ever more imperfect. Another example is like with, back when MP3 players first came out. Some of the early ones had 8 megabytes, not gigabytes, megabytes, which was enough for maybe like 4 good songs. But what you could do is you could rip your CDs at various levels of quality, like lower quality audio. And what you could do is you could put more on and have worse and worse quality. And so you'd have like your original, you know, high quality audio, you know, pristine audio, DVD or Blu-ray quality, and then your copies would be ever worse, all the way down to really low end ones. Now, of course, you have gigabytes of storage, so you can put, even then you start running out of storage. But nowadays you don't, I can't think of anybody now who intentionally like degrades their music so they can stuff more on it. Who would do that? Who would do such a thing? And so those would be like, you know, the ever worse copies of the, you know, perfect original. And so Plato would think that, you know, we're all imperfect humans, but copies of the perfect form of human. Same with like justice, the perfect justice, and then varying levels of, you know, copies of justice. And it's a total mystery how that works, because they're not here, and somehow we, you know, photocopier makes sense. You take the copy, stick it on the copier. But in the forms, it's like, well, how does that work? Because they're not in space or time. There's also the question of how you know about them. And here's the answer. In a dialogue, the Meno, Plato lays out what's known as the doctrine of recollection. And short version is, you learn when you're dead. Meno raises the following paradox, which is, you can't know stuff you don't know, because if you don't know, you'll never know when you get it. And if you already know it, you don't have to go looking for it. So you can't learn anything. Yeah, it's like one of those things. But in a way, it kind of makes sense. For example, if you truly lose your keys and you have no idea where they are, you can never find them because you never know, have no idea where to look. And if you know where they are, you don't have to look. And so, yeah, you just go to them. Like, I know they're in my pocket, so I'm going to look for them. And if I literally had no idea where they were, I could wander around randomly. But if they could be anywhere in the universe, then I would never, never find them, except by pure chance. So Plato has come up with a way we acquire knowledge. So his big problem here, though, is how do you know these forms that are not here? Well, his answer again is this: you learn when you're dead, which is why learning hurts. Because you ever wonder like why school hurts? It's because you learn when you're dead, and so school is killing you. No, kind of. So his claim is when you die, your soul leaves your body and goes and communes with the forms. So you go to the Platonic heaven, and you're somehow there. I mean, he doesn't really explain how this all works. It's super mysterious, but you're kind of hanging out with the forms. And then what happens is, after so much time, well, in the story of the Republic, what he says is this, and he has different versions, that after you're in the afterlife, you are going to be reborn. And he says on the 1,000-year eve of your death, you get to pick a new life. And then you pick your life and you're reborn. And then you may say, well, I don't remember any of this. Now, what Plato says is that when you're reborn, I guess the shock of rebirth erases that. It doesn't erase, but it basically takes away like your directory. To use a modern metaphor. When you take like your laptop or your phone, if you go to your laptop and you just erase, like you take like all the stuff in your hard drive and drive in the trash and then empty the recycle bin, you've erased it, so you really can't, you find it again, you can't access it, but it's still there. It's not gone until you overwrite it completely. And so, also sometimes what happened is, less common now, but used to what happened fairly commonly, was the directory information would get wiped out on a drive. And so like all your files would seem to like vanish. You're like, oh crap, where are my files? Most of the time though, you could go and repair the directory and they'd be back. And so metaphorically, in a way, when we're reborn, it kind of like damages our hard drive. So it's all in there, we just can't see it. Now, Plato believes that what happens is this. We can, through philosophy, repair our hard drive. Back when hard drive problems were much more common, there was utility programs. One of the classic ones was Norton Disk Doctor, which used for the Mac primarily, but also the PC. And you'd have disk problems like constantly because this is the old days of computing, and you'd run that and try to like repair your directory. There's still some like Windows still has like if you go to properties or you click on like a drive, you can do there's tools there. Mac has if you go into your applications, there's a disk utility. But I'm having to use it. I'm like before I used to repair them like every couple of weeks. It's like, oh, my drive's screwed again. Gotta go and fix it. And what philosophy does, according to Plato, is metaphorically speaking, using modern metaphor, it's like it's repairing that directory. So by someone asking questions in the dialectic, it like triggers you in a good way, not a bad trigger. But then you recall things like justice and beauty and so forth. Now, unfortunately, you don't have stored in here like winning lottery numbers or Super Bowl winners. It's all things like mathematics, geometry, justice. And in the Meno, the character of Socrates walks Meno's servant through these geometric proofs. And the claim is that the servant never learned geometry, and that Socrates is merely asking questions, causing the servant to recollect what he had learned when he was dead. Now, of course, critics say that Socrates is asking leading questions. That even if you accept the dialogue as not being like rigged, that Socrates is asking questions that he basically guides the person through the answers. So there is even if you accept the dialogue as not rigged but a true transcript, there is a question of is he really extracting these memories, or is he asking questions in a way that he's guiding the person through the proof? Which is, of course, a question that one should ask whenever someone is claiming to, undo repressed memories. There was nothing to do with metaphysics, but there was a problem in the 90s where the repressed memories were a big thing. And psychiatrists and psychologists would go and, ask kids, like, tell me about the time, yeah.
Like, what's the famous lady that stopped talking to her dad?
Yeah, and it wasn't true. They just said, you tell us about the times you were abused, and people remembered things that never happened. So a fair question to ask is, in the context of Plato is he really pulling out this knowledge of the forms, or is he just leading through these questions? So, but Plato believed that you're hanging out with these forms when you're dead. And so next time, we'll see more of what, according to Plato, we already know, namely the forms. So have a good rest of the day, and we'll see how it goes.
Question.
Yes?
Do you think that we have